morning and welcome to our first webinar within the series of webinars of the EBA community of practice on EBA relevant tools and methods. So today's webinar is focusing on assessing risk and vulnerabilities in the context of EBA, and therefore, we do have different inputs. So first of all, we will have input from Cordula Epple from UNEP WCMC on guidelines for vulnerability impact assessments under EBA. And then, we have the practical experience from Central Asia, from Mountain Ecosystems, from Benedikt Ibele on vulnerability assessments and EBA project. They're based their vulnerability assessment on the guidelines from WCMC. So we are very happy to see their experiences. And then Isabel Renner is going to answer the question how capacity can be built to apply EBA tools. So, yes, my name is Alexandra Köngitter. I'm working for the Global Project Mainstreaming EBA, and I'm guiding you through today's session. Just some housekeeping rules to start the webinar. I will ask you to keep your camera off. It might be easier for some of you to follow the webinar without such a lot of cameras on. So if you want to get involved, please use the chat function on the left-hand side. But you can also choose if you want to send your comments to everybody or just to somebody. And if you have technical issues, we have Carlos Wurschmidt here, and he's glad to help you. So you can send him an email or use the chat function. And just the last notice, this webinar is going to be recorded and we will upload the recordings. I will share the link later on. It will be on the Adaptation community, but we will also have a YouTube channel for our EBA webinars, to share also with those who couldn't attend today. So this for the housekeeping rules, and now I would like to ask Paul Schumacher, who's in the line, to switch on his microphone and to give a brief news on the IUCN World Conservation Congress he attended as a community news. Thank you, Paul.
Okay, thank you, Alexandra. Can you hear me all? Okay. I was asked to shortly give feedback on the IUCN World Conservation Congress, which just took part on Hawaii from September 1st to September 10th. And I participated in this World Congress, and I also we had a session on EBA, and this is why I was asked to share a little bit about our session, and also I thought I can give in general some key insights about EBA, what has been discussed also during this IUCN World Congress about EBA, and what are maybe also key messages for future perspectives related to EBA. So maybe shortly in general, my impression of this event, for me it was like the first event with such a size. There were more than 10,000 participants were registered from, including ministers, scientists, business representatives, also NGOs and everything. And so it was very overwhelming, and also a lot of sessions took part at the same time. So sometimes there were 10 sessions at the same time. So it was also hard to, I would say, grasp the whole scope. And I focused on attending sessions more focused on EBA. And I think in general our community of practice was well represented. So not only me took part there, but I also saw, for example, Ravindra or Xiao Ting from the IAED, and also other colleagues from our community of EBA, community of practice for EBA. And now with a special focus on the sessions, or the session I attended on EBA, it was called ecosystems and society in a changing world, experience, exchange and learning about EBA and eco-DRR that works. Before I go into detail about the session, I would like to highlight that this the session was joined. Initially it was only planned to have it only on EBA, but then we were joined together with colleagues who plan to focus the session on eco-DRR. And this is maybe already one key message that I realized that a lot, like the EBA approach was joined also with eco-DRR. So, and they said that the only difference made between these two approaches was that eco-DRR also looks at like non-climate change related hazards, and the focus so far is more on near natural ecosystems, whereas EBA is much broader in this sense, and it also looks, for example, on managed ecosystems. And in our sessions we had basically two parts. So the first part was more presentations, so case studies also from different parts of the world, where, for example, I also presented our experience from our Central Asian EBA project. And the second part was was more like a group work, and we had triggering questions. And the first one was more focusing that people should list case studies related to EBA and eco-DRR, because I think this is always a big issue that we are lacking cases for EBA. And so we collected a list of case studies, and I think this is also very interesting maybe for the community of practice for EBA, that I could share also the whole documentation of this session, where we also then list all the case studies. And also a second part of the session of this group work, we had the triggering question that what is actually needed to advance also EBA and eco-DRR. And here, in the end, we came up with 3 recommendations. I would say, in general, not really like new or breathtaking. The focus was again that we need, firstly, was more monitoring and evaluation to build stronger evidence to influence policymakers. The second was more focusing on increased education, capacity building, and awareness raising. And the third one is that we need to build stronger case studies. Yeah, I will definitely share the documentation. And maybe also, this was the focus more on our session, and I think it will be also more clear when I share the documentation, also my presentation I gave there. And as a second part, I just would like to highlight general key messages for EBA I took home from other sessions also I attended. And in general, I would say that EBA is a very hot topic. It was highlighted several times that, for example, no solution is complete without integrating nature-based solutions. So also, for example, this UNFCCC Executive Secretary, she also emphasized nature-based solutions to climate change are key. The sessions in general on EBA, I would say they were dominated by usual topics. For example, still discussion what is actually EBA and what makes it different to other adaptation approaches, but also how to make the case for EBA, how to mainstream it. So it seems, a lot of people are also stuck at the same point and also had similar discussions what we had, for example, already in Berlin in June. One aspect which really was quite astonishing to me is that no one is really talking about climate information, even though I think it's often the unique selling point also about EBA, so how to integrate climate information into the planning. And in our session, I had the impression we were the only ones who were really highlighting this topic. And maybe another interesting point was also that many people were saying there is actually evidence on EBA, maybe more in coastal regions than in other regions. And the key is actually to convince the big banks, so to say, World Bank, ADB, for example. And here it's not important only to focus, for example, on cost-benefit analysis for convincing, but also that we have to convince like engineers in these banks, because so far they focus on like gray infrastructure, but when we would like to convince also these engineers, we have to provide them also with some kind of formula for engineers for implementing EBA activities. And related to this, maybe also interesting for the projects in like in the East, in the Asian region and the Ocean Pacific region, is that ADB decided now to put, I think, roughly $2 billion now yearly into climate change adaptation projects, and EBA should be particularly promoted. So I think with them would be a nice upscale potential. And a lot was also discussed on behavioral change, so how to convince communities actually to implement EBA. And there was highlighted that it's often not really useful to talk about, like, directly about the topic. For example, using terms like ecosystems, ecological services, but more convincing communities by talking about national identity, for example, which could potentially trigger more behavioral change. And yeah, I think that's it so far. Maybe the last statement I really liked was from the Prime Minister of Tuvalu from the Pacific Island, because he said that we should stop talking about definitions and concepts, but rather start now to act. So maybe also not talking too much about definitions and how is EBA different from other approaches, but focus more now on cases. Yeah, okay. That's it from my side.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul, for this brief update, and it would be great if you could also share the case studies on EBA and eco-disaster risk reduction within our community of practice.
Definitely, yeah.
Arno's clapping his hand. So thank you for this and for this brief community news. Yeah, and in the next step, we would go on and go to the guidance on integrating ecosystem considerations into climate change, vulnerability and impact assessments from Cordula, which is a very holistic, or it's a good approach for his holistic adaptation planning. And please, Cordula, you have the word.
Thank you, Alexandra. Well, first of all, I'm really pleased to be talking about this guidance here today, because I know that some of the people who are present on the webinar have already consulted this guidance in their work, so I really look forward to discussing with you after the presentation about how helpful you are finding this guidance and whether there's any things that you think are missing from it or could be strengthened. So, what I will cover in the talk is, first of all, give you a bit of background to where the guidance comes from, and then give you a brief walk through the different steps recommended by the guidance, ending with one example of an application in the pilot countries and some key messages. So, for background, the rationale that led us to developing this guidance starts from the observation that although there are already a lot of tools out on how to conduct a vulnerability and impact assessment to guide adaptation planning, many of the available tools, at least at the time when we developed this guidance, did not explicitly consider ecosystems in a systematic way. So we felt that in order to plan for ecosystem-based adaptation measures, a more systematic consideration of the complexity of social ecological systems and their vulnerabilities, and the linkages between the vulnerability of ecosystems and society, should be included. And this guidance was developed within the framework of a project funded by the BMUB on ecosystem-based adaptation in mountain ecosystems, which was a collaborative project carried out in partnership between UNEP, IUCN and UNDP, together with the national governments and local communities in the 3 pilot countries, Nepal, Peru and Uganda. So the idea of the guidance was to also inform the vulnerability assessments that were being carried out under the project in the pilot areas. The target audience for this guidance, there is basically the guidance is intended to address both the climate change practitioner side and the ecosystem-based management practitioner side, to bring together the two worlds and to help each side to take information from the other side into account more. So it is aimed at climate change practitioners who want to carry out more holistic adaptation planning and include EBA in their portfolio, but it is also aimed at ecosystem-based management practitioners, so practitioners already working with the management of ecosystems to integrate climate change into their initiatives. And also one key audience for the report is those who are commissioning vulnerability and impact assessments, because obviously it is they who determine the scope of the assessments that will be carried out. The guidance was intended to be complementary to the established VIA methodologies and tools, and so it is not intended to repeat all the steps or to provide in-depth guidance on all the steps that need to be carried out for vulnerability and impact assessment, but it's rather focused on what would you do specifically at each step to make sure you are fully covering ecosystem-related concerns. And because of the background of the project, the guidance was primarily intended to support vulnerability and impact assessments that are conducted at a sub-national scale, even though a lot of the information could also be relevant for national scale assessments. So the guidance is structured around 6 key steps, and I will walk you through all of them now. So starting with step number 1, which is defining the scope of the assessment. So obviously it is very important to be clear about who the target group of the assessment is, like which is the group of beneficiaries whose adaptation is to be supported by the VIA, and also to identify, link to this, the geographical scope and also the time horizon that we are planning for. Step number 2, this is one of the steps where systematically considering ecosystems is really important. So this step is about understanding the context and focusing especially on livelihoods and ecosystems. So we found that focusing on livelihoods as a basis for structuring the assessment is quite helpful in identifying ecosystem services that are relevant to the different stakeholder groups, even though it is acknowledged that there are also other ecosystems that are important to people that are not directly linked to livelihoods, which might be related to public health or, for example, disaster risk reduction. So considerations that are relevant to all livelihood groups. But yes, we found that livelihood groups are a good starting point, so identifying which are the key livelihood activities in the socio-ecological system and how are ecosystem services important for their livelihoods. And the next step, again, this is one step where ecosystems are often not fully considered in vulnerability and impact assessments, which is about assessing current exposure and sensitivity. So identifying the climatic parameters that are important for the supply of ecosystem services, and take a look at current variability in climate parameters and how they currently affect livelihood groups through changes in important ecosystem services. And this should involve consideration. Oh, I'm sorry, it looks like this graph has shifted a little bit with transferring the presentation. So what this graph is showing is that when we look at the terms that are used by the IPCC to describe vulnerability, vulnerability is defined as being made up of exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. And in the context of ecosystems, it is often very difficult to distinguish between sensitivity and adaptive capacity, which is why the term resilience can be useful. So resilience is seen as the combination of sensitivity and adaptive capacity, which makes a lot of sense when we are talking about ecosystems, because obviously ecosystems are not capable of planned adaptation in the sense that human communities are. So it's often methodologically very difficult to distinguish between sensitivity and adaptive capacity. And so for this step number 3, which looks at the current sensitivity of ecosystems and the communities who depend on them to current climatic trends and variability, ecosystem resilience can be a key consideration. And it is very important to be specific in defining which ecosystem functions are important for the ecosystem services that are being provided to the population in order to be able to assess which climatic factors are influencing them. So often the term ecosystem resilience is used in a very generic way. So people are talking about resilient ecosystems are important, but it is not very clear which characteristics of the ecosystem they want to be resilient. Are we requiring the presence of certain species for this ecosystem service, or is it particular structures of the vegetation that we are interested in? So it is very important to be specific about these characteristics and then to look at exactly the climate parameters that are influencing these characteristics and that are relevant in defining resilience. Step 4, here we come back to a step that is generally carried out under most vulnerability assessment methodologies, which is looking at the current adaptive capacity of the population. So looking at the adaptive capacity of people in the different livelihood groups to the potential impacts that we have identified in the previous step. So how are people currently able to adapt to changes in ecosystem services? Are they able to switch their livelihood strategies? Are they able to compensate for losses of ecosystem services? And bringing together information from step number 3 and 4, then assessing what the current vulnerability of people is to changes in important ecosystem services. Step number 5, this brings in looking into the future. And the approach that we recommend is looking at combined scenarios for climate and development. So also taking into account human development to identify how the future demand for ecosystem services is going to change. So we're not only looking at the supply of ecosystem services and how climate change may affect that, but also whether the demand from society for these ecosystem services will stay the same under climate change and under the general economic developments that are independent from climate change, or whether this will change and therefore we also need to change our vision of what we are aiming through as a result of the adaptation action. And the final step, thinking about how the results of the vulnerability assessment are going to be used in adaptation planning. So making sure that these next steps are already planned for, and so the momentum of the project does not drop after the assessment is completed. To give you one example of application in a pilot countries, so vulnerability assessments incorporating ecosystem considerations were conducted in all the 3 pilot countries, Nepal, Peru and Uganda, under the Mountain EBA project. And some examples of factors that were identified as important under the VIA for Peru. So the assessment identified that key ecosystem services for livelihoods in the area are those supporting livestock in the high mountain pastures, especially for fodder and water supply, because the area is currently suffering problems with drought, and these are expected to potentially increase under climate change. And based on these findings, workshops were carried out to determine the desired ecosystem structure, key ecological interactions and species composition for the supply of pasture and water as part of identifying the adaptation goals and also the project impact indicators. Coming to key messages and lessons learned. So first of all, lessons learned and messages that are coming out from the guidance. The first message is simply that systematic consideration of the role of ecosystem services adds value to vulnerability assessments and adaptation planning. Secondly, consideration of ecosystem services can be included in a range of adaptation initiatives both for EBA and also beyond EBA, which links to what Paul said earlier. We shouldn't create artificial divisions between EBA and non-EBA, or spend a lot of time thinking about whether a certain intervention is EBA or it's not. The concept is that all adaptation activities should be aware of their impacts on ecosystem services and also of the importance of ecosystem services for human adaptation. And finally, the process described in the guidance can be further tailored to the needs of a specific project, and it can also be combined with other tools and approaches. So the guidance is not expected to be used in isolation. And a second set of lessons learned, which comes from not from the guidance itself, but from our application of the guidance in the context of the Mountain EBA program. So one lesson is that it is important to ensure an appropriate balance between scientific and traditional knowledge and local perspectives. So both of these are needed to arrive at a vulnerability assessment that will, on the one hand, be credible to national level stakeholders, which can be greatly supported by having scientific data in it and having the involvement of renowned scientific institutions. But on the other hand, incorporating traditional knowledge and local perspectives is really crucial in order to ensure that the adaptation options being considered are appropriate to the local context, and also that traditional coping strategies are taken into account. And it's also very important for the long-term sustainability of the project by ensuring that the options selected are appropriate to local stakeholders' views. The second really important message that we came to realize through the course of the project was that a two-stage or even several-stage approach to VIA design may be required. So it is not helpful to try and develop the plan for the vulnerability assessment right at the outset of the project and contract an institution and consider this as being set in stone. So although it is creating greater uncertainty for the project and it's harder to manage, it is often very advisable to start off with a rapid assessment to identify the key problems and then focus in on specific points that have been identified as crucially important to adaptation in the region of interest with further studies, rather because there's a big risk of getting the assessment off on a wrong track based on incomplete information at the beginning, and then later on you will wish that you would have spent your resources differently. So trying to split up the VIA process into several steps and doing adjustments at the beginning of each step is a very helpful approach. And finally, another key lesson is that it is really important to plan from the outset for an ongoing adaptation process that is owned by the beneficiaries themselves, and also think about how local stakeholders can be involved in long-term monitoring and evaluation, because this is very often a gap in adaptation projects that they come to the end and it's still not clear how long-term monitoring and evaluation is going to be carried out. So getting the buy-in from local stakeholders and also the relevant government agencies is very important. Some further resources. So after we've developed this guidance in the context of some other projects, we have developed several other manuals, and one of them is covering more the social side of involving stakeholders in adaptation planning. So this is a step-by-step guide for resilience and adaptation planning for communities in protected areas, which could be of interest in this context. And also, in addition to the work that we've carried out on mountain ecosystems, we have developed a coastal EBA decision support tool that provides options for coastal ecosystem-based adaptation and a manual on how to assess the suitability of these options for a specific context. And with this, I would like to thank you for listening to me, and I would be very happy to take any questions.
So thank you very much, Cordula, for sharing this very holistic guidance and also for sharing your experiences from the Mountain EBA project. I think we will have some time for questions and answers right now. So if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand, use the button on the left-hand side, or use the chat, and I will give you the word, or use the chat function, please. So are there any questions? Comments, remarks? Okay. There was somebody with, okay, Michelle. A question to Paul Schumacher. IUCN developed around 2008 in Asia and for coral reef protection a methodology called SLED, Sustainable Livelihoods Enhancement and Diversification. Have you heard of it? It disappeared completely, but it was easy to adapt it to other contexts and had, in my opinion, a very good approach. Okay, thank you for this question. Would you like to answer on this, Paul?
Yeah, I mean, I can say I haven't heard about it because, yeah, the focus is coral reef, yeah, so coastal regions. It is. I just have to read the question again. Okay. No, I haven't heard about it, but yeah, of course, I would be happy to get it and also have a look at it.
Okay, so thank you very much, Michelle, for this comment and for this information. Are there any more questions regarding Paul's input or Cordula's presentation? Okay, there's a question in the chat from Matthias. I will read it out loud. Dear Cordula, thanks for this excellent presentation on vulnerability impact assessments guidance and its application in Peru, Uganda, and Nepal. Question number 1. What was the approximate time frame for conducting this vulnerability impact assessments? And what is the time horizon for future vulnerability assessments? So, Cordula, would you like to answer?
Yes, so on the time frame for conducting the vulnerability assessment, so this is partly behind the reasoning for the last lesson that I mentioned on splitting up the vulnerability assessments into several steps. So we found that the vulnerability assessments were generally taking longer than initially planned. So many of them were planned to take about a year, and many of them took up to 2 years. So, which was obviously a problem for the timing of the project because they came quite late in the project to inform the selection of adaptation options. And in many cases, they rather ended up informing fine-tuning of the adaptation options, which had been chosen in the form of no regrets options already during the time period for which the VIAs were running. So that's one key lesson. Don't spend too much time on the vulnerability assessment right up front. In terms of the time horizon, so I'm imagining this is about what length of time was assessed in the vulnerability assessment. So this was different between the project countries. The minimum was planning ahead for 30 years, but most assessments also had at least one step that looked further ahead than these 30 years, so looking at 50 or 80-year time horizons. Does this answer the question?
Yes,
Hello?
there's an answer. Yeah, thank you, Cordula, for answering these questions. Matthias says, okay, thank you in the chat function. And there's another question to you from Anus Geide. Thank you very much for this presentation, very interesting. And are there more examples of practical implementation of the tool? What you could possibly share?
So I'm not aware of any case studies that have been based just on this tool. I mean, I know I've heard from various projects that say, yes, we looked at your guidance, we found it helpful, but I'm not aware of any that have said we worked specifically from this guidance. So I would have to, look for examples. I don't have any specific examples ready.
Okay, thank you. This for Arno's questions. Are there any more questions in the chat function, or you may also raise your hand and ask them directly. It's easier than typing the question down for some of you. Okay, there's another question from Arno. Yes, Arno, I see you. You want to say something?
Now my mic is on. Hello. Question to Paul. Paul, can you share the presentation, please, that you've mentioned? Because I would be very interested in the results of the workshop in Hawaii. So that would be great.
Okay, thank you, Anna. I think this could also be very interesting for the community of practice, Paul, if you could upload it there. And there was another question from Joris, as far as I can see. Joris, would you like to switch on your microphone? Okay. Joris, you could also use the chat function. Okay, I think there's no raising hands, so we could we will also have a final discussion afterwards. So if you have any more comments and questions, please keep them. And we will now go to Central Asia, and there is a presentation from Benedict. Welcome to our webinar, Benedict, on ecosystem-based adaptation in Central Asia and high mountain regions. And where this is, I think this links very much to Cordula's presentation, as they took much of their guidance for their vulnerability assessments. So please, Benedict, yeah, you have the word.
Yes, hello everyone. I agree very much with Alexandra that this fits very well, and I'm really happy that we had this presentation of Cordula Apple before, because this guidance was actually one of the very important source for us when we designed, if you like, the framework for our vulnerability analysis. So yes, we are working in Central Asia in the framework of the ecosystem-based project, ecosystem-based adaptation in high mountainous regions of Central Asia. And we work in 3 countries, in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. However, since we are only doing really groundwork in Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, the vulnerability analysis were only conducted in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. Our project, maybe very, very briefly about the project. So it has 2 main objectives, the projects. One is the methodology development, so basically to develop and make available an innovative and cost-efficient approaches and strategies for implementing ecosystem-based adaptation in high mountainous regions of Central Asia. So basically, the aim of the project is to develop a methodology with a set of tools and products, if you like, that can be taken up by other projects and can be used if a project or a country in Central Asia would like to implement or would like to do ecosystem-based adaptation. At the same time, and this we do actually with piloting and developing this methodology or these products in the field, if you like, in the pilot. And at the same time, this experience we will get from the ground will then be used to inform the policy level in the 3 Central Asian countries, so then including Kazakhstan, to basically support the systematic anchoring of EBA into national climate adaptation policies and into planning processes of the Central Asian countries, but also to support those 3 Central Asian countries in their, with regard to fulfilling their international obligations under the environmental conventions, and also to support their positions for international climate negotiations. Yes, I guess I do not need to say something about vulnerability. I guess we are all aware, but this is important just as a general overview. Yes, vulnerability in our understanding for this framework we were using consists of exposure and sensitivity, which constitutes the potential impact and the adaptive capacity. So for what we did actually, we first designed somehow, or not designed so much, but more aggregated and synthesized from different sources, kind of a framework for vulnerability assessment. And here you see some sources for that. Since we were from the beginning, we were aiming at not general vulnerability assessment, where there's also a lot of experience already, but we were aiming specifically at vulnerability assessments for ecosystem-based adaptation, so where the ecosystem is in the center. And there we actually found as one of the most important sources also this guidance on integrating ecosystem considerations into climate change, vulnerability and impact assessment, which Cordula Apple was just presenting. We also used some GIZ things like the climate proving for development, the JEF operational guidelines, so on and so forth. I think I don't need to go into detail with that. What is important for our project, and specifically also for the vulnerability assessments we conducted, is our specific setup of the project of different partners. So that's political partners is not really important at this point. It's like usual the respective line ministries or governmental agencies. But for implementing partners, we also have, I would like to highlight 2 scientific partners. One is the Michael Zucker Foundation for the Protection of Nature, and the other one is the GFZ, the German Center for Geoscience. So basically, we have the advantage in our project to have really 2 strong research partners, which actually can support us, or could or did support us, in specifically with regard to the vulnerability assessment, where we have the Michael Zucker Foundation with strong experiences in the assessment of ecosystems, their health, and also their vulnerability, if you like. And on the other hand, the GFZ with their strong importance, strong experience, in particular in Central Asia, with regards to abiotic vulnerability, if you like. We call it abiotic vulnerability. What we mean here is basically the basically how the whole hydrological cycle, if you like, will change due to climate change. So looking into glaciers, looking into what the glacial melt actually does to the hydrological cycle, so we can really have an informed kind of an informed guess, if you like, on what will happen to the water on which the rural livelihoods in Tajikistan very much depend upon. Yeah? And here maybe also one important information is that basically, since we work in high mountainous region of Central Asia, and the project is aimed at ecosystem-based adaptation for high mountainous regions, the glaciers are basically very important for our analyses. And since we also have this objective of developing methodologies, we selected small watersheds which depend on small to medium glaciers, so that we have the whole watershed system, if you like, where we actually can see already how climate change will or might impact the whole system. The small glaciers are important because there's a lot we don't know about climate change, but what we do know is that glaciers in Central Asia are melting, and the small ones will be the first ones to melt. So here we can really have one impact about we are more or less already sure in Central Asia. So that's why we selected those. And this is the framework in which we basically, for which we basically designed this kind of framework for vulnerability assessment. So there are 6 steps, and I guess they're quite similar to the 5 steps from the VIA guidance. So very important, as Cordo Leibler also mentioned, first step definition of scope, then the assessment of current vulnerability, then the development of scenarios for change and scenarios for future vulnerability, then assessment of key vulnerabilities, and then the strategy for ecosystem-based adaptation, which will basically target these key vulnerabilities. What is important to mention also at this point, I will come to that a bit more later, is that for us it was really important to do this kind of vulnerability assessment with a strong participation of the local population. And how we did this, and at what step or at what point the local participation, the local population were participating, I will come to that in a bit. But first, I would like to show you a bit how then our framework we tried to operationalize. So basically, this is a big confusing slide, I know, and it's really not important to understand everything. It is just kind of one step summarized. The assessment of the current vulnerability of the social ecological system. Yeah, this really is where we try to break it down to, in the end, also the specific organization and the specific or specific partner and specific roles of the different organizations. So where we can really see also, so this because this we then also use to really define kind of the different tasks of the different organizations. But here you see, for example, assessment of current vulnerability. We then defined into exposure, looking into exposure sensitivity and adaptive capacity, and they're always looking from on the natural system side into biotic and abiotic. And this division between biotic and abiotic is mainly due to this specific partner structure we had. Yes, this is maybe just to show you that when it comes to the assessment of the key vulnerabilities, we were actually using the kind of IPCC criteria for assessment of key vulnerabilities. It's not so important at this point, just to show you. And then also for the assessment of the EBA measures, we use certain criteria. So if you see the third column from the left, here we have the criteria we actually are using to assess EBA measures, which ones we then use. But this is not so much a topic for now. This was just to show you what we mean by this framework and how we try to operationalize it. This is, I think this we can skip for now. This is basically the same thing, just a bit differently presented. But I guess we just go to the next one, because I think what is really interesting for us now here is to understand a bit in what way we were doing or what we actually did with the local population in order to really ensure the participation of the local population in the vulnerability assessment. So here we have these 5 steps we somehow identified. We are really not sure how we call them now, but this is still work in progress. But I guess it gives you a good overview of what we are actually doing in the pilots, and from which we would like to then develop this methodology of how for high mountainous regions of Central Asia such a vulnerability assessment and then the definition of an EBA strategy could or should look like. So yes, of course, definition of scope in the beginning. What we also found really, really important, it is not a step in itself because it is ongoing, but the training of facilitators for this field work is really, really important because first of all, we have persons who are good in field work, but what we really miss is persons who are good in field work, who have a good understanding of climate change, and then of climate change adaptation, and then on top of that of ecosystem-based adaptation. So here, this we defined really as a key success factor to bring people onto the same level and have facilitators who really understand what they are doing. So, and then the next step is basically what was done is basically the what I called before the biotic vulnerability assessment, which is basically kind of an ecosystem services assessment, because from our understanding, if we talk about vulnerability assessment also for ecosystem-based adaptation, then ecosystem services are at the heart of it. What will be their future state and health, and how far they will be also available in the future. So basically, this is what the Michael Zucko Foundation mainly did to really assess what are ecosystem services the local population depends upon, and what is their current vulnerability. Yes, so this is the step of the current vulnerability. This was done obviously in the pilots, but also already with kind of a participation of the local population with some mapping of participatory mapping of resources and ecosystem services, if you like, also. What then comes in, and what we later found out is really something that is not really common, unfortunately, or not always common, let's put it like that, is that we then basically really developed jointly with our partners from GFZ, but then we also had their strong involvement of the WWF-US and the CCSR, which is a joint venture of Columbia University and NASA, to really develop for us these adapted and localized projections for climate change, so that we really had kind of projections for climate change for our pilots. And adapted here means basically that it is adapted to the needs for our vulnerability assessment, mainly meaning the time frame. Time frame is, for example, that we really want something that is already relevant for a planning period, relevant for the local population, so 20 years. Usually projections are for 50 years or more, so we wanted to have this for a shorter period, and also to have somehow the seasons adapted, because the seasons in high mountainous regions are not the same seasons like you have in Europe, for example. The winters are longer, yes. So basically, so when we talk to the local population and we say winter, we might mean something different than they understand. So that's why we actually, together with the WWFs and CCSR, adapted those to the local understanding of the seasons. And with this, then we went basically to the community and did this community workshop, where we then basically discussed with the local population their understanding of it, and then so they are kind of, first of all, got back to this participatory mapping exercise that was done before, went into the maps again, and did kind of a scenario planning, to which I will come in a second also, where we then basically looked into or discussed with the local population what would happen if this change will happen in your watershed, if you like, or in your village. Yeah? And then jointly with the local population, we're identifying options for adaptation. These, of course, then need to be prioritized, and for some there are feasibility studies necessary. This is a process that is ongoing now, and that is then already also verified again with the local community, so that we do not just go out with information and come back and say, well, this is what we decided, but more that it is also in a participatory way. That is basically the overviews. Yeah? So what you see here on this slide is basically what we also used as a tool in the village to really come to these adapted seasons. As you see on the right picture, for example, this is basically the seasons that the local population were telling us they are understanding. And this is why we adapted the climate projections also to these seasons and not had them in our traditional seasons. So autumn shorter, winter longer. Yeah? And at the same time, we also, this is another tool which you see on the left photo, which is basically kind of seasonal calendars where there are certain activities which are basically, or the activities that the local population are doing, which is then connected with a certain season, for them to also understand if certain climatic stimuli change in a certain season, what kind of impact that will have, or if seasons change. And what we did with this information also in order to come to kind of an impact chain, if you like, of these climatic changes projected, is basically to build a conceptual model which is based on the open standards methodology. I think I will not go into detail with this. It looks very complicated, but it's actually kind of the conceptual model just shows us basically if a certain change happens to the system, what this means for the livelihood. But it goes via the natural system. So basically, for what kind of ecological element on what kind of ecological element the climatic stimuli is impacting, and what that will mean for the ecosystem services, and what that will mean for the human well-being in the end. Yes, so that we basically have this kind of climatic, that we have a conceptual model that really shows us what impact the climatic stimuli has on the livelihoods and the human well-being, but via the natural system. And this is in particular important in high mountainous regions, because there people are mainly depending only on the natural systems, and so there, and this is also where we see that ecosystem-based adaptation is the solution, and that's why we go here via this open standards methodology. And to give you a bit more of an idea of the scenario planning, what we mean by that is actually that we are, when we discuss with the local community what kind of the adaptive projections for climate change, we identify jointly with them together what kind of projected climatic change will be affecting the local population most severely. So, for example, if spring precipitation gets more, that will be a problem for the villages in Tajikistan, because then they will have problems with pests. Yeah? So they identified that this climatic stimuli which the projection shows, that might be a problem. And we picked these kind of stimuli and put them onto these axes, if you like. Yes, so spring precipitation. So because we have this uncertainty in the projections, as you sure are all aware. So if the spring precipitation, according to the projection, either stays the same or gets more, we define this axis with regard to spring precipitation. And on the one end, where we have then it stays the same, on the other hand gets more, but ideally also with a bit more information. And then we define these kind of axes with the local population, what is important for them, and define out of them scenarios, which are, yes. So basically, if we define two axes, we have 4 scenarios. Yes, we have spring precipitation and summer temperature, for example, where we say spring precipitation either stays the same or gets more. Summer temperature either increases or decreases, which gives us 4 scenarios for a future change. And these 4 scenarios we then discuss with the local population in order to really find out the future vulnerability of the local population in their own perception. So this was basically the step for the scenario planning, but I guess that it was good to go into this a bit more, because this is really at the heart of the participation of the local community. Here I just show you again very briefly these steps with the communities, and I guess that's already it from my side for now. Thank you very much, and yes.
Okay, so thank you very much, Benedict, for sharing your very specific experiences in Central Asia from the mountain regions, and also for showing the EBA steps in the pilot regions. And I think we have some time for some questions right now, and for those who joined us later, feel free to use the chat function or to raise your hand. On the left-hand side, you can see a symbol to raise the hand, and you can ask them directly through the microphone. So are there any questions, comments, remarks? Okay, thank you very much. I think the first question is from Jonathan, and then there would be a question from Cordula. So please, Jonathan. You only have to click on your microphone symbol, which is red by the moment, and you can...
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. So thanks very much for that presentation. I think I have 2 main questions. The first one has to do with how you came out with the scenarios. I'm kind of curious to know how you came out with those different scenarios, especially how you showed that in the functions, and also how the different scenarios relate to EBA adaptation. And the second question has to do with, you made mention that you had a strong focus working with the local communities, and I think usually working with local communities has its own challenges. Probably what are some of the lessons that you learned that you could share? Thanks.
Yes, so the scenarios, yes, that's so basically what we did is that we had these projections for localized projections for climate change, which were then also adapted to this to the seasons, for example, and to the local perception, so that the local population really understands what this projection says. And we then identified with them what kind of climatic stimuli would really affect them negatively. And this gives us one of these axes I showed you. And then we compiled these axes and then prioritized these axes. And ideally, we come out in the end with 2 axes, and both of the pilots, this also worked. So we basically have these kind of 2 axes, which we then lay upon each other, or like in cross, as I have shown you, which gives us these 4 scenarios of a possible future climate in the villages. And then in group works, we go again into every single scenario and discuss with them jointly, or they tell us also what this scenario would mean for their livelihoods. I hope that was clear so far. With regard to challenges with the local community, yes, there are always a lot, but it's always also, in my opinion, very rewarding to work with the local community. I guess language is always the biggest barrier. And by language, I not only mean the local language, but also some kind of our project and scientific language, and kind of a language that a rural person understands, that a farmer understands. That's, I guess, a very big barrier. And then even if we struggle in Tajikistan, for example, we struggle also with local languages which are specific to one valley. So we really, and this was one lesson learned we took out, is that actually we developed kind of a glossary of terms we use. Yes, we talk about vulnerability and projections and all these, and even more simple terms which are really difficult to understand for the local population. So I guess that's one of the biggest challenges, and glossary is a lesson learned, and also the training of facilitators in that regard is also something I mentioned before, but that's also something I guess that's really a lesson learned, where there needs to be put a lot of emphasis for the work with local communities.
Okay, thank you very much, Benedict. There's another question from Cordula.
Yes, I wanted to ask about two things. One is, in your presentation of the methodology, you had quite a strong split between the assessments related to the biotic environment and the abiotic environment, where the biotic factors were the ones that were addressed by fieldwork, which, as I understand, also involved local facilitators, and the abiotic aspects were all covered by the expert team. So I was wondering whether that split was really as strong as that in practice as it looked in that table, and whether you found any value in trying to bring the two methodologies together. And the second is just because I know you've been looking at our guidance, whether you could name the number one thing that you would like to add to the guidance to make it even more helpful for the type of assessments that you are conducting.
Yes, thank you for this question. Especially the first question is a very good question, a very valid question, and this is also something we are struggling with for many reasons. It was really difficult to bring these two together only from the timing already. First of all, this has to do with some specifics of the project administrative. I do not want to go into now. It is not important. But on the other hand, also, if we talk about these abiotic assessments, in particular, if we talk about glacial dynamics and hydrology, we face the big problem in both of the countries that there's simply no data available. And in order to make kind of even only informed guesses, there needs to be a measurement of at least 2 years or so of river flows and observation of glaciers and these kind of things. So, I mean, the question here is always how scientific do you need to be and how practical you should be. This is also something where we somehow always, well, I think this is a meta question, or we always have to discuss in our project. But anyways, what I mean here, so I really see this as a big challenge to bring this together. In particular, in our project, this is due to the setup of the project, but also due to the conditions in these countries. And yes, I hope we can still bring this a bit more together than it is now. Yes, let's put it like that. With regard to your second question, I guess I would have to look into the guidance again, because when we did this framework, that's already more than a year ago. From now, and I guess I do not remember exactly what we took from where, but if you allow me to take some time to look into it again, I would really like to give you feedback on that.
Okay, thank you for this, Benedict. Cordula's answer in the chat is yes, please. That would be great. Okay, so thank you for this. With this, we would go on to our next presentation. Thank you, Benedict, also for your comments and answers. And right now, we would go to the presentation, or to the questions on how to build capacities to apply those EBA tools. And the presentation is done by Isabel Renner, who developed the training course, Mainstreaming Ecosystem-Based Adaptation into Development Planning. Isabel.
Yes, hello, also from my side. Like for the next, I would say 5 or maximum 10 minutes, I would like to draw your attention to some new developments in the area of capacity development, and specifically one activity, which is the update and the further development of the training course, which is called Mainstreaming Ecosystem-Based Adaptation into Development Planning. So the background, there was an existing training course on ecosystem-based adaptation, which was based on the GIZ climate change adaptation training, and it was developed by EcoConsult. There were also some new developments in related trainings, related in terms of content, like, for example, the ecosystem services assessment training, and also a specific training on marine and coastal ecosystem-based adaptation. So the new training, or the updated training, includes aspects and also materials from these trainings. And additionally, the global project conducted a needs assessment beginning of this year. And of course, the update of the EBA training was building on these findings. like a brief overview of the results of the training needs assessment. It was conducted in GIZ projects and programs in 12 countries. And basically the question was, what do practitioners need for EBA implementation? So in terms of result, one area was like a general understanding of the EBA concept and approach. Also clarifying synergies with other approaches. In the beginning, we talked about the eco-disaster risk management, but also other approaches like landscape management, ecosystem services approach, integrated resource management, and so on. A second area, which I think showed like the biggest demand, was practical tools. For example, we talked about vulnerability at risk assessment, but also in terms of monitoring and suitable indicators for ecosystem-based adaptation. Another area is, or category, is stakeholders and governance, like the whole issue of understanding what makes people behave the way they do, what kind of institutions do we need for EBA, and how can we influence policy making. And finally, as well, according also to the focus of the global project, mainstreaming EBA into existing policies. How can we upscale EBA measures? What type of communication and negotiation skills do we need in order to mainstream ecosystem-based adaptation into different policies and planning? And last but not least, financing. I think that is also an issue which was also mentioned by many of the participants in this needs assessment. Based on this, basically the new design is a modular structure. It consists of 4 main modules, which you can see on the left-hand side, and each of the modules includes a number of sessions. I think one main improvement of the training is that these sessions can be combined more or less freely, and that can help you to design a tailor-made program. Each of the module consists of an input, which can be given by a trainer or by an expert or even by a participant, and different types of exercises in order to practice what has been dealt with in the theoretical input. I won't go into details of the sessions. I think you can read it, and you will also receive the slide. So we also drafted some overall learning objectives. Important to note that each of the modules and each of the sessions has its own learning objectives. So like the general one, or first of all, I think what is important that the focus is rather on process orientation, how to conduct or how to design the process of integrating EBA or mainstreaming EBA, rather than on specific technical knowledge. So the first learning objective relates to basic principles of EBAs, like clarifying terms, concepts, definitions. I think in each country it's very important as a starting point to have a common understanding about what is EBA and what it is supposed to be like. Then the next one relates to methodological aspects and tools. Important after training, there will be probably the participants won't be expert in tools, but they are supposed to get an overview and a general understanding of tools, and in order how to choose them, or in order how to design terms of reference. That is like the main objective. And the last ones relate to like the governance and policy making side of EBA, how to identify entry points, suitable policy instruments for EBA mainstreaming, how to communicate EBA, and also how to address specific challenges and enabling conditions for the implementation. So again, it is a basic training. It relates to the basic principles of EBA, and the focus is on process orientation rather than on specific technical knowledge. The methodology, first of all, the training draws on or is based on the EBA mainstreaming cycle, which is a systematic approach developed by GIZ. And if you would take like the basic schedule of the training, then a 2 or 3 day training course would guide you through each and every of the mainstreaming steps. You can use a real case, or several real case studies, or you can use a fictitious case which is provided in the training materials. And of course, it builds on an interactive learning approach. So there are some inputs, technical inputs, but there's a lot of group work, different types of learning tools in order to make it as interactive as possible. I mentioned that in each of the module and each of the sessions in each module there are different elements, like an input, a group work exercise, could also be a role play, and there's plenty of time for discussion and reflection. In terms of participants, the training has a rather broad target group. Ideally, we would recommend mixed groups. So it is addressing practitioners, basically, and that could be participants from government, from the public sector, could be NGO, civil society, could be science researchers, and of course also technical staff from development projects and programs. That is basically it. What else is important to know? The final version in English will be ready by end of this month, and in case you're interested in the training, the contact person is Alexandra, and yes, I'm happy to answer any questions now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Isabel, for this. Just a last comment. Well, as Isabel mentioned, if you have any further questions on the training or would like to do it, I will give you my email address within the last slides. So there are some contact information. And I would now open the round for last questions, comments, remarks. For those who joined later on, you can raise your hand. On the left-hand side, there's a little button, and I can see there's also a chat question from Cordula. I will read it out loud. This looks like a very helpful resource that could be worth recommending to some of our country partners. Is it openly available, and has it been translated into other languages as well? So perhaps I can comment on this, Isabel. Cordula, the translation will be done. Right now it's in English, but we will have other versions, also in Spanish and French. And yes, for further questions, feel free to address me. Thank you. Are there any more questions, remarks? Okay. I see that this is not the case, so I would go on to the next slide on the next steps. Just just the last question. Nok Eng. In Vietnam, we have developed and trained some training institutes on mainstreaming EBA into the development planning. In the last quarter of the year, we plan to conduct some trainings for our partner. Could Global EBA project also provide any support? Thank you, Nok Eng, for this comment and for this question. I think we would answer it bilaterally. I will send you an email after this webinar session. Thank you. Okay. So if there are no further questions, thank you, Isabel, for your input on the EBA training and how to build capacities for applying EBA tools and methods. And also thank you once again to Cordula and Benedict for the guidance and also for the specific experiences from Central Asia. I think this were very interesting inputs, which combined very well. And with this, I would like to announce the next 2 webinars. As said, this webinar is part of a series on tools, EBA tools and methods, and we will have 3 webinars in total. And the next one will take place in October, and there will be another webinar in November on EBA tools and methods. So in the meantime, we have a discussion on Global Campus 21, and we will wrap up this discussion within our webinar series. And well, as said, all webinars will be recorded and uploaded on the Adaptation community, and we will also establish a YouTube channel where you can find the recordings, because we will have just one session per webinar, not two different and identical sessions to cover different time zones. So this, for those who are in Latin America right now, they can see the webinar recordings later on adaptationcommunity.org, and I will also share the link in Global Campus 21 and on YouTube. And afterwards, in December, we go to our next big topic, which is evidence on EBA. And we will start an internal discussion on Global Campus 21, which starts in December and goes on in January. And afterwards, we will start a webinar series, also 3 or 4 webinars, addressing the questions on Global Campus 21. So if you have any additional topics, special topics, interests, needs, or if you would like to give an input in one of those webinars, feel free to contact me. I will show my email address on the last slides. And with this, thank you very much for your very active participation, for the highly interesting inputs. And so if I see there's another question. Models on sustainable agriculture. Okay. Thank you, Jonathan, for this. Sorry if I didn't see your question beforehand. It can be integrated in the modules on sustainable agriculture. Thank you for this, and sorry if I didn't see your question beforehand. With this, I would like to close this webinar for today. Please see my contact and for further questions or comments, also for the upcoming webinars. And I'm looking forward to seeing you again in the next session in October. Thank you very much. And yeah, many thanks also for the presenters and speakers.